All right. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Going to be continuing to talk about what it means that Christianity is religious, not spiritual, or that uh, when it's a religion, not a gnostic spirituality. If you remember, Gnosticism rejects the flesh, it rejects history, and it rejects institutions as ways that you can connect with the divine, or that the thing that the divine actually rescues you out of, that we're flung into those things and that we need to be saved from those things. But actually, Christianity works the opposite. Jesus was saved. He saved us through his flesh and back into our flesh. He saved us through history, his work in history, and he saves us back into history. And we're in the middle of talking about what does it mean that our salvation was through the institutions that God established, right? So we talked about priesthood, what priesthood was, that Jesus is a priest. He was saved through the official. We were saved through the official priesthood of Melchizedek that he inherits by being the son of David, and then we're saved actually back into our priesthood, and we'll talk about that more. But we talked about what priesthood was by looking at Adam. Well, now I want to talk about what kingship is, because Jesus is also king. In fact, he's king of kings. He is in the emperor of the world. He's the king of kings. But the question is, what is kingship? Right? When God established kingship, what was it? Because Adam was established as the garden king. He was the garden king in the garden. He was the only human being, which made him king of the human race. But it obviously it went wrong because he didn't use his kingship the way he should. He didn't use his royalty the way he ought to have. So the question is, what was it? What was he supposed to do with his kingship? And this is what a king does. A kingly job is to represent, is to judge, is to take dominion or to dominionate. I don't have a good word for that one because the word dominate has been um, ruined by English speakers. So to take dominion would be to dominate in a linguistic sense, but dominate actually doesn't communicate properly what Adam is supposed to do. I have been trying to come up with other words to and you've got beautify maybe or decorate, but those don't really that's not the whole essence. Beautify, I think, is closer or better than decorate. Ornament, there's something to that. Uh, uh, that's a hard one to exactly establish what it is, because we don't really have a word for it, because that is one of the things that individualism and Gnosticism reject. And so the English language has been gutted of its ability to talk properly about dominion. So we're going to have to be making up words and work on that. And then the last thing is to establish decorum, or to decorumate, which is a word I totally made up, but I really like it. To establish decorum, and we're going to talk about what that means as a king. So the first is we'll start by talking about represent, right? He's supposed to represent the human race to God, right? That he is the representative of the whole human race because of his kingship, right? That's a part of his, excuse me, that's a part of his kingship, to represent the human race to God. This is why Adam's sin is what wrecks the human race, not Eve, right? Because Eve wasn't the king, she wasn't the representative of the human race, so she sins, but it doesn't throw the human race into problems. Adam actually has the ability in that moment to should have represented her even in her sin in a proper way that could have protected the rest of the human race, and by rescuing her. But instead, he blames her, and that's a part of why Adam's sin wrecks the human race. But this is also why Jesus needed to be born of a virgin, because he needed to be born outside the direct descendancy of Adam as the representative of the human race in order to be a new Adam. So he's supposed to represent the human race in his kingship, to take responsibility for the human race and to represent it well and lead it well. And he's also supposed to represent God to the world, right? He's the Imago Dei. We talked about last week that a part of being the Imago Dei, or a central part, is that we're the kind of creature that can have fellowship with God, right? God, um, he, which is what Dei means, the image of God, right? Because we are in the image of God, we can have fellowship with God. Well, we also see that because we're in the image of God, that we can represent God to the world, that we can be the creatures that represent God to the world. That God begins the gardening process. He begins the dominion process by taking Adam into the garden and watching and showing him the garden growing up, and then we take over the oversight that God had at the beginning, right? So we are the sub rulers of the world, representing God to the world. We're the ambassadors, or Adam was supposed to be an ambassador of God to the world, an ambassador of God's rule to the world. But he failed in all of those things, representing both God to the human race and representing God to the world. Primarily, he failed first by failing to represent God faithfully to Eve, who is the whole human race, but also to the dragon. He could have represented God to the dragon. He should have represented God to the dragon better in a defense, by being defensive, by defending and guarding the world, but he didn't. So the first thing is, a king represents his nation, his subjects, his people. And Adam was supposed to represent the whole human race. The second thing is to take dominion, right? To bring the world to its intended end. And I talked about how dominion, or domination, now is a bad word, but that's because we failed in the dominion mandate. We have used the world rather than use the world in the wrong sort of way. We're supposed to use the world in such a way that it becomes more fruitful, right? That we're supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and then our dominion is takes the command that was given to us and says, well, this is what God, when God rules something, right? He rules when he's ruling us as the image of him. He rules us in a way that says, be fruitful and multiply. Well, that means that what we're supposed to do as the Imago Dei, the representatives of God to the world, is go to the world and say, let us help you, world, be fruitful and multiply. Let's garden this place. Let's get more fruit, and then take it to its intended end. And we'll teach the world what fruit can become. We'll make wine, out of blackberries, right? You take blackberries, and you see that when you crush them up and you get the juice out of it, and you get the yeast that's on the outside of the fruit, and you push them all together, that the yeast starts to bring wine, or bring the juice to its glory. That there's this glory hidden inside the juice that's called wine, and God put those things all together, and we, by taking dominion, we help the world become fruitful, but we also help the world become everything that it's intended to be, right? So we're the gardeners of the world, and a gardener, when the world shows up, it needs a gardener, and when the gardener shows up, the world becomes what it's supposed to be. I mean, you saw this when they made it illegal to cut down trees in the public lands in California. All of a sudden, they started to burn down. Right? They burn down because they don't have a gardener there taking care of them. They need the world needs a gardener, and that's not that's a uh, that's a good relationship between the garden and the gardener. So when the gardener takes dominion of his garden, the garden becomes more than it was before, right? And then in there's all kinds of fruit that comes out of that then he can bring back to his family, right? So one of the things about dominion is recovering the resources from the land and bringing them back to his family, bringing back for use, for the human race to use well, right? And so this is why dominate brings up uh, uh, images of tearing down all the trees, of strip mining, or of what they're doing with lithium mines right now. Those sorts of really destructive practices um, aren't bringing the world to its intended end. Right. So um, the and it's odd that when the green movement, quote unquote, gets involved, the world becomes less green, right? That the conservationist movement was actually, something that Christians were a part of, were pushing, right? That they looked around and they said, let's conserve this place. The green movement says, let's get people out of the way so that the world can just go wild, become what it's supposed to be. But the world doesn't become what it's supposed to be when it's wild. The world needs the image of God to say to it, to work with it, to help it become fruitful, to help it multiply, to help it become what it's supposed to be. So the conservationist mentality is a blessing to the world. So we're supposed to represent the world, or Adam, as the Garden King, was representing the world. He was dominionating the world, bringing it to its intended end. And then he's also supposed to judge. This is part of the role that a king has in the world, is to judge. And there's a deep poetic nature to being a good judge, right? Adam was supposed to bring old things together with new knowledge and join them together and make a judgment when the dragon comes into the garden, right? He's supposed to listen to what the dragon says, who's saying new things. He's supposed to take the old things, take the new things that he's learned, and then make a proper judgment. And that's a poetic process, right? It's an art sort of process. And this is why Moses sings to the people after judging Pharaoh. This is also why at the end of Deuteronomy, all that Moses has learned, and he's been judging for 40 years in the wilderness according to the Ten Commandments. He puts together what he's learned into 3 sermons, and then he ends it all with a song, right? He embeds his wisdom, all that he's learned while judging, into a song at the end of it, right? So he starts with a story, with a history. He breaks down, the second sermon in Deuteronomy has 10 sections, one about what he's learned judging for each of the 10 commandments. And then he ends with a future looking curses and blessings. This is what I've learned about the nature of reality that God has established, that he is present as judge. God is present as judge. And when we live according to his judgments, then we find that he blesses. When we live against his judgments, that we find curses. And then he wraps it all up with a song, with poetry, right? It's the same thing with Solomon, right? He's the wisest king, well, because he was raised on the law, right? And he was raised on the judgments, on the statutes, and he was raised on the poetry of his father. His father's poetry was reflections on the law, reflections on how he saw God acting in the world. There's some prophecy in there as well, but mostly it's reflections, poetic reflections on the law. He's distilling his wisdom down, and he passes it on to his son. So his son is well exercised on poetic judgment. So when he faces his first trial, what do you need? He says, I know what I need. I need wisdom. All right. When God comes to him and says, what can I give you? He says, I need wisdom. And he's the first person that we're told has the knowledge of good and evil, because he's well exercised on the poetic judgment, right? And this is exactly what Adam failed in. He was given a new situation, and he didn't poetically bring together what God had commanded with the mission that God had given, and with the gift of Eve, right? That's the information that Adam had. He had information that what God had commanded. He had information about the mission that he'd been given. He had the information about the garden that he'd been given, and he'd been given the gift of Eve. And he failed to bring wisdom to bear, to bring all these things together in a poetic judgment, and that made him a bad king. It's the same thing that you see with the Pharisees. They are poetically dull. They can't tell which is the metaphor and which is the reality, and so it's made them their spiritual dullness at root is a poetic dullness. And then the last thing that a king does is he establishes decorum. He decorumate is a word that I have made up about this one, but this is the one that we just literally don't have a word for anymore. That he establishes the customs of the human race. Adam's supposed to establish the customs of the human race, and how is he supposed to do it? Well, he's supposed to do it in line with reality. Now, this is fourth day stuff, right? When God puts the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky, they're established as rulers. They're established so that his job is to become an astronomer that looks up, learns how the rulers of the day and the night function, how the rulers of the times and the seasons function, how the rulers of the customs for celebration function. Learn wisdom from those rulers that God established in the sky, and then apply it into his rule of the human race by establishing set customs. Now, we reject customs outright, right? Well, that's just a custom means it's not true. But that's actually the opposite. That's a gnostic way of thinking that if it's just a custom, that it's automatically not true. The question is this custom in line with reality or not? Right? That Adam was supposed to establish new customs, establish protocols for how the human race was to deal with one another, establish uh, the way that justice was going to be done, establish he was supposed to establish judgment protocols, establish custom protocols, establish celebration protocols, right? And establish a calendar, all these things. The customs of the human race were supposed to be in line with reality, in line with wisdom. They were supposed to be in line with the way God had created the world, in line with the relationship between God and man. And then those customs were supposed to then be a part of how they took dominion over time in order to make time fruitful, make time multiply, make time something beyond what it was, so that you see this when it's Christmas Eve and the excitement that comes with when you've got kids, you've got the house decorated, right? That you have multiplied time. It feels longer because you're looking forward to something coming, right? And that building of anticipation, it multiplies time, right? But it also makes time fruitful. There's sweet, good things that are brought together as we work through the decorum and the customs that we have as a human race. And that's one of the things that's so sad as we watch court protocols go away, when we watch royal protocols go away, there's a really great essay that C.S. Lewis wrote about Milton and decorum, and the putting on our best clothes in order to celebrate a moment, celebrate a time. That we've actually lost the word for that in English, because we've lost all the honor of decorum, but that's because we've been turned into Gnostics. And so a restoration of decorum, a restoration of protocol is centrally important to our return to the royalty we have in Adam, to be sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, the kingliness and the queenliness that God intends for the human race. Well, and then Adam, he failed in all these things, but Jesus, he actually enters into the institution of kingship. He enters into the royal institution as the son of David, right? He's the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn, all the way back to Solomon, who's the legal firstborn of David, right? And he's the legal firstborn, even though he was seventh born. His older six brothers abdicate the throne to him, and he's the firstborn of the firstborn of the firstborn, all the way back to Judah. Uh, um, and then you have he's really all the way back to Pharez, right, who was the second born, but Zerah's whole family's killed. So, and then Judah he's the legal firstborn. Even though he's the fourth son, he's the legal firstborn, uh, all the way back to Abraham, right? And Abraham is the firstborn back to Noah, and Noah is the legal firstborn of Adam, right? So Jesus enters into the kingship of Adam in order to represent a new human race, right? And in order to judge rightly, to sit on the great white throne and judge, but also judge throughout history by his spirit. And then to beautify, right, to dominionate, to bring the world to its intended end. It says that all things will be put under his feet until the last enemy, death, is destroyed. And then he is reestablishing decorum, and this is what the whole section in Colossians is about, that we're no longer under the old world. We're no longer under the old calendar. We're no longer under those old things, and instead we've been moved. So, because we're no longer under the sun, the moon, and the stars, we've been seated at the right hand of God over the sun, moon, and stars in Christ. So Christ has been lifted over the the customs, the rulers. He's all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, right? So the sun, the moon, and the stars hand their authority over. So now Jesus is over them, and he's establishing decorum, and he's actually given it into the hands of the church so that we can grow in wisdom and establish customs for the new human race in line with reality. And then that should flow out to all of the ways that humans establish customs, right? That establish a calendar, right? There are calendars in this world that we should just ignore, right? No, that calendar is not in line with reality. But we should be actively working to establish a new calendar because Jesus has established us as stars in the sky, right? And that's what stars in the sky do. Because Jesus has established us at the right hand of God, because we're no longer subject to those things. We're no longer under the moon. We are now over it, right? So we're in charge of the customs of the human race as a whole, right? Not just me individually, but we as a whole should be working to bring the decorum in line with reality. So it's and that's a kingly sort of task. So Adam was a priest. Jesus is a new priest. Adam was a king. Jesus is the new king. And we'll look next week at Adam as a prophet and Jesus as the final prophet. Thanks for joining me.